Norway, 2011. 12 wolves, released into a quiet forest near the Swedish border. A quiet experiment, barely announced, barely noticed. Within 3 years, rangers started noticing something strange. Rivers were changing shape. Trees were growing back in places they hadn't grown in decades. Animals nobody had seen in years began to reappear. One forestry officer called it the strangest thing he'd witnessed in 20 years of fieldwork. No one had planned for this. No one had predicted it. A handful of wolves, and an entire ecosystem quietly rewriting itself. This is the story of what happened when Norway brought the wolves back, and why, even now, scientists are still trying to understand how 12 animals changed a forest. The plan started small, a joint program between Norwegian and Swedish wildlife agencies. 12 wolves, fitted with GPS collars. Released into the Hedmark forests close to the border, the goal was simple on paper. Rebuild a wolf population that had almost vanished by the 1960s. Track them, study them, let nature take its course. Most locals barely reacted. A few hunters grumbled. A few farmers worried about livestock. But nobody expected what came next. Erik Solberg, a forestry researcher stationed near Trysil, was the first to notice something odd. Deer populations were shifting, not dying, moving. Herds that once grazed lazily near riverbanks were suddenly avoiding open ground. At first, he thought it was seasonal. Then he checked years of data. Nothing matched. The deer weren't just avoiding wolves. They were avoiding entire zones of forest, even where no wolf had been tracked in months. It was like the fear itself had spread faster than the wolves. Erik started walking the riverbanks personally. What he found stopped him cold. Young willow and aspen trees, some over a meter tall, growing in areas that had been stripped bare for almost 20 years. He'd walked this same path 5 years earlier. Back then, it was empty ground. Now, it looked like a different forest entirely. He didn't understand it yet, but something about the sight unsettled him. Not danger exactly. Something bigger, something the data couldn't explain. He picked up his radio and called his supervisor. What he said next would trigger a full-scale investigation into the forest. Within a week, a small team arrived at the site. Wildlife biologists, river ecologists, even a geologist, brought in almost as an afterthought. Nobody expected geology to matter. That assumption didn't last long. The team leader, Dr. Lars Henriksen, had studied Norwegian forests for over 15 years. He'd seen droughts. He'd seen recovery after logging bans. He hadn't seen this. Riverbanks that had been eroding for decades were suddenly stabilizing. Root systems from the new trees were holding soil in place. Water channels that had widened every year were narrowing again. Henriksen stood at the edge of one bank, staring at data he didn't trust yet. He ordered a second survey, convinced someone had made an error. The second survey came back with the same numbers. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A young field assistant, checking camera trap footage, noticed something in the beaver activity logs. Beaver dam construction had tripled in 2 years. Nobody had reintroduced beavers. Nobody had changed water management policy. They were simply returning, on their own, to areas they'd abandoned years earlier. Henriksen sat with that footage for a long time. He later told colleagues it felt like watching a machine start running again after being switched off for decades. But one detail troubled him more than the rest. The wolves in this area had killed almost no deer that season. Fewer kills than any previous year on record. If the wolves weren't hunting much, then why was the entire ecosystem behaving as if they were everywhere? Henriksen couldn't shake the question. If the wolves weren't killing, what were they doing? He pulled every GPS log from the 12 collared wolves. Movement patterns, resting spots, time spent near open ground versus dense cover. A pattern emerged that surprised even him. The wolves weren't hunting the deer. They were haunting them, moving through valleys just often enough to keep herds on edge, never settling in one place for long. Deer that once grazed for hours near riverbanks now fed in short bursts, heads raised, always ready to move. That single behavioral shift was doing something logging bans and conservation funding had failed to do for 20 years. It was giving the forest room to breathe. Henriksen brought the findings to a regional briefing in Oslo. He expected mild interest. Instead, The room went quiet. One government ecologist, Anders Wick, stood up and asked a question nobody had considered. If fear alone could reshape a forest this fast, what had the absence of that fear cost Norway for the last 60 years? Nobody had an answer. Then came a report from a separate team, working 2 valleys south. Something had changed in the fish populations. Cold, clear streams that had grown murky and warm for decades were shifting again. Fewer collapsed banks, more shade, more oxygen. It made no obvious sense. Wolves don't touch rivers, they don't touch fish. But something connected to them clearly did. And what the researchers found next would make even seasoned scientists uneasy. The team traced it back to the willows, young trees growing thick along the riverbanks for the first time in decades. Their roots held the soil. Their branches threw shade across the water. Cooler water meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant insects returned. Insects meant fish had something to eat again. A geologist on the team, Petter Aas, called it a chain reaction nobody had built on purpose. 12 wolves. Changing where deer walked, which changed which trees survived, which changed the rivers, which changed the fish. Aas said it out loud in a meeting, almost as a joke. Then he stopped smiling. Because if this was true, it meant Norway had misunderstood its own forests for half a century. Every management plan, every logging restriction, every million kroner spent on erosion control. None of it had worked as well as 12 animals doing nothing but existing. Word started spreading beyond the research community. Local hunters, once furious about the wolf release, began asking quiet questions of their own. One old trapper near Trysil, a man who'd hunted the region for 40 years, told Henriksen something that stuck with him. He said the forest sounded different now. More birds, more movement. He said it felt like the land was waking up after a long sleep. Henriksen didn't know how to respond to that, because the data agreed with him. But there was one more finding waiting. Something buried in the soil samples. Something that would connect this Norwegian valley to a forest 6,000 kilometers away, where the exact same story had already played out once before. Petter Aas had seen the pattern before, not in Norway. In Yellowstone National Park, decades earlier. Wolves had been wiped out there too, back in the 1920s. And when they were reintroduced in 1995, something eerily similar happened. Elk stopped lingering by rivers. Willow and aspen trees came back. Riverbanks stabilized. Beavers returned. Scientists called it a trophic cascade, a chain of consequences spreading outward from a single change at the top. At the time, some researchers doubted how far the effect really reached. Norway's forest was now giving them a second answer, 6,000 kilometers away, with almost identical results. Henriksen stood at the edge of the same river Erik Solberg had walked months earlier. The willows were taller now. A beaver dam sat quietly downstream. Somewhere beyond the tree line, one of the 12 collared wolves was moving, unseen, doing nothing dramatic at all. Just existing, just being feared. That was enough to rebuild what 60 years of policy couldn't. The program is still running today. Wolves remain one of the most debated animals in Norway, and disagreements between farmers, hunters, and conservationists haven't gone away. But the forest data keeps telling the same story. One predator, 12 individuals, an entire landscape quietly rewritten from the ground up. Sometimes the biggest changes don't come from what a species destroys. They come from what it makes everything else afraid to do. If this story surprised you, there are more like it waiting. Stories about nature doing things science didn't expect. Subscribe if you want to see where this goes next.